Why did silence always feel heavier in the briefing room? Captain Riley Thompson sat at the far end of the table, eyes fixed on the glowing tactical map. Around her, voices rose and fell, men debating approach vectors, weapon loadouts, odds of survival. Yet not one of them looked at her. Not one invited her into the conversation. It was as if she were furniture, not a pilot. She'd gotten used to this over the years. The sideways glances, the whispered doubts, the laughter when she walked into a room full of men who believed the sky belonged to them. And yet, every time it hurt. Not enough to break her, but enough to carve into her like a blade, a reminder that in their eyes she was a passenger in their world, not a pilot with wings of her own. But today was different. Today the silence carried weight. At 5:47 hours, the base siren had screamed to wake the pre-dawn calm, the kind of alarm that didn't ring for drills. Riley had been dressed in seconds, her coffee still half finished, her checklist abandoned on the desk. And now, standing before them, Colonel Hayes looked like the war itself had aged him. 500 men are trapped, he said flatly, his voice cutting through the chatter. Bravo Battalion walked into the worst ambush we've seen in 5 years. The map shifted on the wall, satellite images painting a valley swallowed in smoke and red heat signatures. Riley felt her throat tighten. 500 soldiers, entire families worth of fathers, sons, daughters, brothers, hemmed in, surrounded, cut off. No one spoke, not until Hayes dropped the second blade. Extraction attempts have failed, 2 Chinooks down, 1 Black Hawk gone, surface-to-air missiles dug into every hilltop. The weather window closes in 4 hours. If we don't get them out before then, he didn't finish. He didn't need to. The silence pressed harder. Captain Jake Morrison, the squadron's golden boy, decorated cocky, broke it. "Sir, with respect, this is an Air Force job, not helicopters. We won't survive a run through that valley." The words hung in the air. Not wrong, but not the full truth either. Riley knew it. She could see the terrain already, her mind tracing invisible flight lines over jagged mountains, missile arcs plotted like a deadly chess game. It was suicide, but there was still a chance. A thin thread of possibility if someone dared grab it. Hayes' voice dropped lower. "I need volunteers, I won't order it. Odds are close to 0. The room was still. Engines idled on the flight line outside, a reminder that time was dripping away. Riley could hear her own heartbeat in the pause that followed, and then she heard her voice. "I'll take it." The air froze. Heads turned. For a heartbeat, no one said a word. Then Morrison laughed, actually laughed, like it was a punchline to a bad joke. "Come on, Riley. This isn't a simulator. 500 lives. This isn't a training hop." "I'm aware," she said, her tone carved from granite. Collins, another senior pilot, leaned forward with his smirk. "Sweetheart, you know what happens when the first missile locks on. You freeze. You've never been under this kind of pressure." Sweetheart, that word again. That word that reduced every hour of blood, sweat, and survival into a cheap dismissal. Her hands tightened into fists under the table. She wanted to shout. Instead, she took a breath. Steady. Focus. Anger was useless here. My flight records speak for themselves. More combat hours than anyone here except the colonel. Morrison didn't blink. Combat hours delivering supplies. Not this. Not extraction under fire. "Then volunteer," Riley shot back. "Right now, say you'll do it." His jaw worked, but the words never came. His silence was louder than hers had ever been. Hayes' gaze moved slowly across the room. Anyone else? No one moved. No hands lifted. A room full of men who wore wings, men who carried the legacy of aviation in their chest patches, and not one of them spoke. Except her. Hayes finally nodded. "You're authorized for immediate departure. Take Apache 77 Alpha. Full countermeasures, maximum load. Call sign Guardian Angel." Riley rose. She felt eyes follow her as she walked for the door. Behind her, Morrison muttered, "She'll last 20 minutes. then a real pilot will have to go clean up. Riley stopped in the doorway, not turning. When I bring them home, Captain, I expect a public apology. Every word you've spoken about women in the cockpit, you'll eat them in front of everyone. Morrison chuckled, but it was hollow now. Sweetheart, if you pull this off, I'll write your Medal of Honor citation myself. Riley didn't answer. She walked out. The flight line was chaos, engines roaring, rotors slicing the cold dawn, ground crews racing like ants across tarmac. Apache 77 Alpha sat waiting, its frame dark, armed, bristling with weapons like a predator ready to hunt. Riley ran her hands across its skin like a surgeon preparing for a patient. She knew this machine better than she knew her own reflection. It wasn't a helicopter. It was an extension of herself. Maria Santos appeared at her shoulder, young, steady-eyed, always calm under pressure. "Ma'am, I want in." Riley glanced at her. "You've got a baby at home. This is a one-way trip." Santos didn't blink. "So do those 500 soldiers. They have families too. And if you're going to make multiple runs, you'll need me on comms and weapons. You can't do it alone." It wasn't courage in her eyes. It was something deeper, duty, quiet and immovable. Riley gave a sharp nod. "Strap in." The engine screamed alive, the vibration rattling through Riley's bones. As the rotors lifted, the helicopter shuddered like a beast eager to run. Guardian Angel, cleared for immediate departure, weather window closing fast. She pulled collective power and the Earth fell away. 50 feet above the deck, she dropped into nap of the Earth flight, low enough to vanish under radar, fast enough to blur the ground. The world became a smear of forests, rivers and ridges rushing past beneath them. Static hissed in the headset, then a voice. "Guardian Angel, this is Bravo 6. We're pinned, ammunition low, 40 wounded, they'll hit us again in minutes. Extraction timeline." Riley keyed the mic. "Bravo 6, ETA 12 minutes, walking wounded first, 8 per load, multiple trips." Silence, then disbelief. "Multiple, you're planning repeat insertions. That valley is death, Guardian Angel. Not leaving anyone behind." For a moment the radio carried only wind and static. Then finally, "Copy, Guardian Angel inbound." The first missile launch was almost invisible, just a smoke streak slicing upward. Santos caught it on radar. "Missile inbound." Riley didn't think. She threw the Apache into a violent roll, the G-force slamming her chest. Flares spat into the sky. The missile curved, confused, then detonated harmlessly against rock. Another lock, another launch, 2 this time. Second volley, 3 o'clock. "Hold on." Riley yanked cyclic, diving the Apache into a canyon so narrow the rotors sliced the air 10 feet from the walls. The missiles followed, overshot and slammed into stone. The shockwave rattled them but left them alive. Santos let out the breath she'd been holding. "You're insane." "Correction," Riley muttered, eyes forward. "We're alive." The canyon spat them out into open sky and the valley opened before them. Smoke, tracer fire, burning armor. The nightmare of war painted across rock and dirt. At the center, purple smoke curled upward, Bravo Battalion marking their landing zone. But it wasn't a landing zone. It was a killing field. Every enemy weapon shifted toward that smoke. "Suppressing." Santos' voice cut through as she lit up the ridge with the 30 chain gun. Explosions ripped enemy positions apart, but new ones kept firing. Riley flared hard, slammed the Apache into the dirt. It wasn't a landing. It was survival, wheels skidding against earth as soldiers sprinted toward them under fire. 8 bodies, bleeding, limping, dragged by their brothers in arms, piled into the cramped bay. "Loaded." Riley yanked them airborne. Enemy tracers stitched across the cockpit glass. An RPG whooshed past, missing by feet. Then they were gone, lifting, vanishing low into terrain, racing the sky back toward base. 15 minutes later, wheels hit ground again at the medical station. Medics rushed the wounded. Riley didn't power down. Fuel ammo now. Ma'am, you need rest. Fuel and ammo. Her voice cracked like a whip. 492 left. Her hands shook as she adjusted throttles, but she hit it. Inside, exhaustion pressed already, but under it was something else. A steady flame, the kind she had carried since flight school, since the first day they told her she wasn't built for combat. She would prove them wrong, not with words, with every trip into that valley. And yet, even as the crew rushed to reload her, a question gnawed at the back of her mind, a quiet whisper beneath the roar of engines. How many trips could she make before luck ran out? How many trips could a single helicopter make through hell? That was the question no one asked out loud, but Riley could feel it weighing on her chest as Apache 77 Alpha clawed back into the night sky. Fuel lines had barely been secured when she yanked the collective, blades screaming, engines straining. The ground crew had shouted after her, warnings, maybe even pleas, but she didn't hear them, or maybe she didn't want to. The first run had shaken her more than she wanted to admit. Her hands had trembled on the cyclic, not from fear, at least that's what she told herself, but from the sheer intensity of it. Every second had been survival on a knife's edge, and that was just one trip. 60 more to go. Maria Santos sat beside her, headset pressed tight, hands moving across consoles with practiced precision. Riley glanced at her once. Blood from a nick on her cheek streaked her flight suit, a souvenir from a stray shard of glass when that RPG detonated too close, but her eyes steady. "You good?" Riley asked. "I'll be good when we're done." A simple answer, but Riley knew what it cost to say it. She almost envied Maria's clarity. For Riley, it wasn't so simple. Doubt gnawed quietly at her edges. Was this courage or recklessness? Was she flying to save lives or to silence every smirk, every laugh, every word that had told her she didn't belong here? The voice of Bravo 6 crackled over comms. "Guardian Angel, be advised, enemy repositioning. They're moving heavier guns toward the landing zone." Riley's jaw clenched. Of course they were. The enemy wasn't stupid. They knew now. Knew a helicopter was daring to challenge their cage. They wouldn't let it happen twice without answering harder. "We'll adapt," Riley said, more to herself than anyone else. Santos scanned radar. "Southern Ridge looks clear. Less SAM coverage if we come in low and fast along the tree line." Riley adjusted her heading, hugging the contours of the earth so tightly the skids nearly kissed dirt. The Apache wasn't just flying. It was stalking, slithering through valleys like a predator that knew it wasn't the biggest beast in the jungle. Then contact. Radar blips flared red. Santos' voice sharpened. 2 launches northwest. Smoke trails lanced through the darkness. Riley didn't flinch. Instead, she drove the Apache lower, skimming a ridge so close branches slapped the fuselage. Flares burst from the chopper, glowing stars falling behind them. Both missiles veered, exploding harmlessly into forest. But the sky didn't stay quiet. Another launch, closer. Santos cursed, "They're locking faster now." "Then we stay faster." Riley shoved the throttle, the helicopter roaring to a speed that blurred the world. Her body pressed back into her seat as they tore across the valley floor, riding turbulence, skimming danger. She knew it couldn't last. No pilot could outrun missiles forever. But maybe, just maybe, she could stay unpredictable long enough to matter. The landing zone was a scar on the earth, lit by gunfire and tracer arcs. Purple smoke still marked Bravo Battalion's desperate beacon. Around it, chaos. Riley saw figures firing from foxholes, others dragging wounded into shallow ditches, the ground pockmarked by explosions. It wasn't a battlefield. It was a grave waiting to be filled. She flared hard, dropping the Apache into the zone like an avenging blade. The chain gun roared as Santos shredded enemy emplacements on the ridge. Soldiers surged forward, 8 of them this time sprinting with desperation. They piled in, dragging one man half-conscious, his blood painting the skid. "Loaded." Riley yanked them up, rotors clawing the air. Another RPG arced toward them. She twisted, felt the blast rock them, alarms shrieking in the cockpit. Hydraulic pressure dipped into yellow, not critical, not yet, but fragile. The flight back was a blur of turbulence and shouted comms. Riley's focus tunneled, her body one with the machine. Each correction, each evasive maneuver was instinct, not thought. When they finally dropped their second load at base, she exhaled like she'd been holding her breath for an hour. 8 more safe, 484 still waiting. Fuel, ammo, back up again. By the 5th trip, her hands no longer trembled. They were too numb for that. Each landing zone was hotter than the last. Each liftoff carried new scars. Bullet holes spiderwebbed across the cockpit glass. One skid's paint had been melted by near-miss incendiaries. Santos had a strip of bloody cloth tied around her arm, still working comms and firing weapons like nothing was wrong. By the 10th trip, Riley's muscles ached from the constant strain of countering turbulence, G-forces, and impact landings. Her throat was raw from clipped radio calls. Her heart was a drumbeat, steady but heavy. And yet there was something else inside her now, something she hadn't expected, a strange calm hidden inside the storm. Because every time those soldiers scrambled aboard, faces caked with mud and blood and desperation, every time their eyes met hers with shock that she had come back again and again and again, something inside her hardened. She wasn't just proving herself anymore. She wasn't just silencing doubts. She was keeping promises. She was giving families back fathers and mothers. She was dragging hope back from the edge of extinction. But hope came at a cost. On the 12th run, a burst from a heavy machine gun ripped across their fuselage, alarms screaming as hydraulic fluid sprayed into the air. Riley fought the stick with everything she had. Santos, voice cracked. "We're losing control." "Not yet," Riley snarled, forcing the bird down onto the LZ with a bone-cracking slam. Soldiers threw themselves inside, adrenaline overriding terror. Riley lifted them skyward, systems bleeding out, controls heavy as lead. Somehow, she coaxed the dying machine back to base. Mechanics swarmed, shaking their heads at the damage. "You're done," one shouted. "This aircraft can't fly again." Riley shoved past him. "Fuel, patch what you can, we're not done until they're safe." Her eyes met Santos through the cracked visor of her helmet. Maria's gaze said what her voice didn't. This wasn't bravery anymore. It was obsession. But Riley ignored it, because in the back of her mind one thought repeated. If she quit now, if she let another pilot take over, no one else would keep going. Not through this. Not trip after trip into hell. By the 20th run, exhaustion blurred everything. Hours felt like days. Her body screamed. Even her voice cracked over comms, but still she flew. Bravo 6's voice came over the radio during a brief pause. "Guardian Angel, this is Bravo. We've counted. 160 evacuated. We don't know how you're doing this, but God bless you." Riley closed her eyes for a heartbeat, sweat dripping down her temple. She didn't answer. Blessings didn't belong in cockpits. Only skill, only survival. But inside, a flicker of warmth broke through the fatigue. A reminder. She wasn't just fighting missiles and bullets. She was fighting despair itself. Still, the question clawed louder each time she lifted into the air. How many more before luck ran out? On the 25th trip, the answer came. The missile struck the tail. It was almost invisible, just a flash, then a roar. The Apache spun violently, alarms howling, the earth twisting into a blur. Santos' shout cracked in Riley's headset. Tail rotors gone, we're going down. Riley's world became chaos. The bird whipped, spun, slammed. She fought every instinct, muscles screaming, teeth grinding. The horizon became sky-ground, faster, faster. Impact. A deafening crash, metal screaming. The world tumbled sideways, and then silence. Riley hung in her harness, ears ringing, breath ragged. Blood trickled from her brow. The cockpit was tilted, smashed against dirt. Smoke hissed from panels. Sparks flickered. Beside her, Santos slumped unconscious, blood streaking her forehead. "Maria," Riley fumbled, heart hammering. She pressed fingers against her neck. Pulse. Steady. Relief nearly broke her in half. She keyed the mic with shaking hands. "Bravo 6, Guardian Angel down. Repeat, Guardian Angel down. We're alive. Aircraft destroyed." Static, then the voice strained, desperate. "Guardian Angel, hold position. We'll send a squad to retrieve." "No," Riley cut in, her voice low, iron-hard though her body shook. "You don't have men to spare. Hold your ground, I'm not done." She looked at the broken machine around her, smoke curling from consoles, twisted metal biting into dirt. Any sane pilot would abandon it, walk away, wait for rescue. But Riley wasn't sane. She was something else entirely. Her hand slid across ruined controls. Systems still glowed faintly. Engines intact. Main rotor bent but spinning free. Tail rotor gone. The one thing that made directional control possible, obliterated. Flying this thing again would be suicide. But in her chest, the flame burned hotter. "Impossible," she whispered to herself, pressing trembling fingers to the throttle. "Impossible for them, maybe not for me." The question wasn't if. The question was how many more she could carry before the impossible claimed her too. How do you fly a machine that shouldn't fly at all? Riley stared at the ruined cockpit, smoke curling through cracks in the shattered glass. The tail rotor was gone. Any pilot would tell you that meant the end. Without it, torque would spin the helicopter like a child's toy, uncontrollable, doomed. Any pilot except her. Maria Santos groaned beside her, consciousness flickering back in painful waves. Riley touched her shoulder, checking her again. Alive, battered, but breathing. Relief softened Riley's chest for a heartbeat. Then the weight of reality pressed down. 298 soldiers still trapped in that valley. Storm clouds building darker by the minute. No backup aircraft, no time. "Riley," Santos whispered, eyes glassy, "we're done. Birds finished." Riley looked at the wreck around them, then at the horizon where tracer fire still lit the mountains. "Maybe for most pilots," she said quietly, "but maybe not for us." Her hands moved across the ruined console, checking what systems remained. Engines functional. Main rotor damaged but operational. Hydraulics weak but alive. Tail rotor obliterated. It was madness. Everyone knew you couldn't fly an Apache without that stabilizing force. Everyone except the tiny part of Riley's mind that refused to accept limits. She remembered reading once, Vietnam pilots limping home with aircraft torn in half, improvising aerodynamics no textbook had ever written. Legends born not from perfection but desperation. Maybe she could be that desperate. Santos blinked at her. "You're serious? You think you can fly it like this?" "I don't think," Riley said, tightening her harness. "I know I have to." Her co-pilot shook her head weakly. "This is suicide." "Maybe," Riley admitted, "but doing nothing is worse." The engine screamed back to life under her touch. The fuselage lurched violently, spinning the moment it lifted an inch off the dirt. Alarms blared. Santos cursed, bracing herself as the cockpit twisted like a carnival ride. Riley's jaw clenched, every muscle straining as she fought the controls. She used cyclic inputs, pushing against the rotor's torque, forcing the helicopter to balance in an unnatural dance. The bird bucked, spun, threatened to flip. But slowly, agonizingly, the spin steadied into something barely controllable. Not flight, not the way flight was meant to be, but survival. "Guardian Angel," she whispered, almost to the machine itself. "Stay with me." They rose, jerking, shaking, tilting like a wounded predator. Barely stable but airborne. Static cracked across comms. Bravo 6's voice came ragged, incredulous. "Guardian Angel, are you flying that thing?" "Affirmative," Riley gritted out, sweat dripping down her temple as she forced another correction. "Inbound for extraction. Have 8 ready." "8, you're still, God help you." The soldiers waiting in the valley looked up as the crippled Apache limped toward them, listing, fighting its own mechanics. For a second, no one moved. They couldn't believe what they were seeing, a helicopter flying without the very system that made flight possible. But disbelief turned to action. Purple smoke marked the landing zone again. Gunfire shredded the air, enemies determined to swat down the impossible bird. Santos unleashed the chain gun, bursts hammering enemy positions even as her arm bled fresh through the bandage. "I've got them, Riley, just get us down." Riley's teeth ground together as she muscled the helicopter onto dirt. The skids slammed so hard her spine rattled, but they were down. 8 soldiers scrambled aboard, eyes wide at the sight of the mangled cockpit, the glass cracked, the woman at the controls bleeding and shaking yet still flying. Loaded. The takeoff was worse than the landing. The helicopter spun, bucked like an angry bull, and for a second Riley thought they'd roll over and die. But with perfect timing, perfect instinct, she countered, found balance where no balance should exist. The crippled bird staggered skyward. The 15 minutes back to base were the longest of her life. Every second was a war, not against missiles, not against enemy fire, but against physics itself. Her body ached, tendons straining with constant corrections. She couldn't rest, couldn't blink. If she faltered for even one breath, the helicopter would spin itself into earth. But she made it. The wheels slammed down at the medical facility, bending further from the abuse, but they held. Medics dragged the wounded free. The ground crew swarmed, staring at the ruined bird with open disbelief. "Ma'am," the chief shouted, "this machine is done. No tail rotor, cracked hydraulics, you can't take her back up." Riley climbed out just far enough to look him in the eye. Her voice was calm, steady. "Fuel, ammo, now." He gaped. "Captain, this helicopter shouldn't even be in the air." "Then it's a miracle," Riley said flatly. "And I'm not wasting it, fuel her." The crew obeyed because something in her tone made argument impossible. As they worked, Santos leaned against the frame, bloodied but defiant. "We're really going back in that. Again." Riley looked at her. For the first time, she didn't answer with orders. She answered with truth. "If I stop now, no one else will take over. They'll die in that valley. And if we die trying," she trailed off, eyes on the storm building overhead, "then at least we tried." Santos nodded once like a soldier sealing her fate. "Then we try." For the next hour, Riley Thompson did the impossible. 36 times she lifted the broken Apache into the sky. 36 times she fought it through impossible conditions, every trip a gamble against physics and fate. On the 31st run, an RPG exploded close enough to crack her visor and tear shrapnel into her shoulder. Blood soaked her flight suit, but her hands never left the controls. On the 33rd run, a rocket hit so close the concussion knocked Santos unconscious for seconds. Riley flew alone, one hand firing weapons, the other forcing the wounded bird into a semblance of flight. On the 36th, lightning split the sky, rain lashing the cockpit, visibility near zero. Yet still she landed. Still she lifted 8 more souls out of hell. Every trip carved her body thinner, every muscle screaming. But her spirit had become something untouchable. By the time the last soldiers clambered aboard, Bravo Battalion reduced but alive, she felt nothing but a hollow, weary fire. The kind that burned only because it refused to die. When they landed for the final time, the base erupted in movement, medics rushing, mechanics swarming, commanders standing in disbelief. Riley sat in the cockpit for a long moment, staring at the cracked glass, at the blood on her gloves, at the trembling of her hands. 500 men saved. Her voice cracked as she whispered to herself, "We did it." But in the hollow silence that followed, a darker thought curled in her chest. At what cost? What happens when the roar of battle fades and only silence remains? The base had never been so alive. Engines thundered, medics barked orders, Stretchers streamed through corridors. Soldiers staggered off the battered Apache, some collapsing into the arms of waiting corpsemen, others clutching each other as if afraid that if they let go, the earth itself would swallow them back. And yet, amidst all that chaos, Riley sat still. She remained in the cockpit long after the last soldier had been pulled free. Her hands rested on the controls, blood-streaked and trembling, unable to release their grip. The machine vibrated faintly under her, damaged, broken, still humming as if it too refused to surrender. She and the helicopter had become one creature in those hours, sharing blood and defiance. Letting go now felt like betrayal. "Captain," a voice called from outside. "Captain Thompson, engines are down, the medics want you checked." She didn't move, not until Maria Santos, pale but standing, leaned into the cockpit and touched her shoulder. "Riley, it's over." Over, the word echoed strangely inside her skull. Over meant safe. Over meant alive. Over meant 500 soldiers saved from certain death. But over didn't erase the faces still etched behind her eyes. The pilots who hadn't volunteered, the men who had laughed, the soldiers she hadn't reached fast enough, who bled out waiting for her return. Slowly, like an old woman, Riley unbuckled her harness. The moment she stepped onto the ground, her legs wobbled. Santos caught her with steady hands, despite her own injuries. For a moment, pilot and co-pilot leaned against each other, two bodies held upright by something stronger than bone. Then came the silence, the kind of silence that follows the storm, heavy, disbelieving, almost sacred. Mechanics stood in stunned circles around the Apache, staring at its shredded fuselage, its missing tail rotor, the bullet holes spidering across every panel. Their faces said what none dared speak. This bird should never have flown, not once, not 36 times. The first to break the silence was Colonel Hayes. He approached with slow steps, his face carved with lines deeper than war alone. When he stopped before Riley, his salute was crisp, sharp, almost reverent. She blinked at him, unsure if she had the strength to lift her hand in return, but she did barely. "Captain Thompson," Hayes said, voice steady despite the weight it carried. "On behalf of the United States Army, I want to thank you for the most extraordinary display of courage and skill I have ever witnessed." The words washed over her. She wanted to answer, to say something profound, something that matched the gravity of the moment. But all that came out was raw honesty. "Sir," she said softly, "I was just doing my job." Hayes shook his head. "No, you did far more. You redefined what we thought possible." Other figures approached, officials in press uniforms, their eyes wide with awe. One woman, tall, stern, with stars on her shoulders, stepped forward. "Captain Thompson, I'm General Patricia Williams, Army Aviation Command." Her voice carried authority, but also warmth. "What you accomplished today will be studied in flight schools for decades. You saved 500 lives and shattered the last doubts about women in combat aviation. You've proven beyond question that courage has no gender." Riley nodded, though the words slid over her like water over stone. She wasn't thinking of gender. She wasn't thinking of history or policy or the textbooks that would carry her name. She was thinking of the soldier who'd bled out on the landing zone while she circled for another approach, the one she hadn't been fast enough for. She wanted to tell them she didn't feel like a hero, that all she felt was exhaustion, grief, and a hollowness that victory couldn't fill. But instead, she gave them the polite nod expected of a soldier and stepped away. Inside the pilot's lounge, the atmosphere shifted. Conversations stopped as she entered. Every head turned, men who had refused to volunteer, men who had doubted, mocked, dismissed her. Now their silence was heavy with something different. Not scorn, not disbelief, something closer to shame. Captain Morrison stood among them, pale, stiff-backed. His eyes, once sharp with arrogance, now carried something else entirely. Riley stopped in front of him. Her voice was calm, quiet, but it carried through the room. "Captain Morrison, I believe you owe me something." The pause was unbearable. Every pilot in the lounge leaned forward as if the air itself depended on what he would say. Morrison swallowed, his jaw tight, his pride bleeding out in front of everyone. "I was wrong," he said finally. "About you, about women in combat, about what was possible. I publicly apologize for every word, every doubt." He lifted his chin, voice trembling but clear. "You proved that courage, skill, and determination don't wear a gender. They just are." The words struck Riley harder than she expected. Not because she needed them. She hadn't flown for his apology. But because hearing them meant one less barrier for the women who would come after her. She nodded, apology accepted, and "Captain." "Yes, ma'am. I'll be expecting that Medal of Honor recommendation you promised." For the first time, Morrison's lips twitched into something like a smile. "Already written, ma'am, already written." The room exhaled. Some even smiled faintly, not out of joy but out of relief that maybe the world was shifting even just a little. That night Riley lay in her bunk, the silence pressing against her. No engines, no alarms, no gunfire, just silence. She should have slept for 12 hours straight, but her eyes stayed open, staring at the ceiling. Exhaustion had claimed her body, but her mind replayed every run. The smoke, the tracer fire, the soldiers' eyes as they scrambled aboard, the endless question that haunted her: how had she survived? And more haunting still, why her? 500 lives, families reunited, medals, speeches, history books, they would all say it was triumph. But lying there, Riley felt the weight of something else. Not triumph, not pride, just the simple, heavy truth that survival always costs more than anyone admits. Sometimes, victory isn't about what you gain. It's about what you lose in the process. What does it mean to stand in the light when all you feel is the shadow? 3 months later, Captain Riley Thompson stood in the rose garden of the White House. Cameras flashed. The air buzzed with the murmurs of officials, reporters, soldiers in dress uniforms. The President of the United States stood at a podium, words echoing across history. For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of her life above and beyond the call of duty, Captain Riley Thompson's extraordinary heroism and selfless devotion resulted in the evacuation of 500 soldiers from certain death. Applause erupted. Flags rippled. The Medal of Honor was draped around her neck, the ribbon heavy, the medal pressing against her chest like a weight she wasn't sure she could carry. Everyone saw triumph, but inside Riley's heart there was only stillness. The moment the medal touched her uniform, her mind flashed back to the cockpit, the alarm screaming, the smell of burning hydraulics, the sight of Maria bleeding beside her. She remembered the soldier with half his face bandaged, gripping her hand as if it were the last anchor to life. She remembered the silence after each takeoff, wondering if it would be her last. And she remembered the ones she hadn't reached fast enough. The crowd clapped. The president shook her hand. Her name would be written in textbooks, her face plastered across screens. The first woman pilot in history to receive the Medal of Honor. But none of it felt like victory. That night after the ceremony, she sat alone in her hotel room. The medal lay on the table, gleaming under a lamp. Reporters would have called it a symbol. The army called it honor. Riley stared at it and thought, this is the price of survival, shaped into metal. The knock on the door startled her. Maria Santos stepped in, arms still wrapped from lingering injuries but eyes sharp as ever. "You should be celebrating," Maria said softly. "They're out there drinking champagne in your name." "I don't want champagne," Riley muttered. "What do you want?" The question lingered. Riley stared at the medal, then at the window where the city lights blurred against glass. "I want to stop hearing the rotors in my head every time I close my eyes." Maria sank into the chair across from her. "It doesn't go away overnight." "Does it ever?" Maria didn't answer, and the silence between them spoke louder than words. The weeks that followed pulled Riley into a world she had never wanted: press conferences, interviews, photo ops. Everywhere she went, strangers stopped her, their eyes wide with admiration, their voices filled with awe. Hero, inspiration, proof. Proof that women could fly combat missions. Proof that courage had no boundaries. Proof that even the impossible could be conquered. She smiled when they expected it, nodded when they spoke of inspiration. But inside, she felt split in two. Because for Riley, it hadn't been about proof. It had been about survival, about not letting 500 men die because everyone else was too afraid to try. One night at a banquet in her honor, an older general approached her, glass in hand. "Captain, you know what you've done. You've broken barriers. You've given young women across this country a reason to believe they belong in the sky." Riley forced a polite smile. Inside, her chest tightened. She thought of all the times she had walked into briefing rooms and felt invisible. The laughs, the dismissals, the sweetheart comments that burned like acid. Yes, maybe she had broken barriers, but she wished it hadn't taken 36 trips through hell to do it. Back at Fort Liberty, her days were different. She wasn't just another pilot anymore. Soldiers saluted sharper. Pilots stood when she entered. Some offered apologies in small, awkward sentences. Others avoided her eyes, ashamed they hadn't volunteered when she had. But with respect came distance. She wasn't one of them anymore. She was something else, something untouchable. And Riley hated it. She wanted to be in the cockpit, feeling the vibration of the rotors, mapping terrain in her head, losing herself in the discipline of flight. Instead, she was buried in meetings, policy discussions, training reforms. She became a symbol, not a soldier. Then one afternoon, Colonel Hayes summoned her to his office. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes carried a gentleness she rarely saw. "Riley," he said quietly, "the aviation school has requested you. They want you to design a new curriculum, based on what you did out there. Flying damaged aircraft, surviving the impossible." Riley blinked. "You want me to teach?" "Not just teach. Change the way we prepare pilots. Your name will live in those manuals long after you're gone." Her chest tightened. A part of her swelled with pride. Finally, the next generation wouldn't have to prove what she had already proven. But another part ached. Manuals couldn't capture what it had felt like. Manuals couldn't teach the silence of a cockpit when you weren't sure you'd make it back. But she nodded anyway, because if she could spare even one pilot from carrying the weight she carried, it would be worth it. Weeks turned into months. The world moved on, but Riley didn't. Nights remained restless. Some mornings she woke with the echo of rotors in her ears, the taste of smoke in her lungs. Maria once found her sitting in the hangar at 3 a.m., staring at Apache 77 Alpha's ruined frame, now retired and mounted as a museum piece. "Can't sleep?" Maria asked gently. Riley shook her head. "Every time I close my eyes, I'm back in that valley." Maria leaned against the cold fuselage beside her. "You know, when I was bleeding out in that cockpit, I thought we were done. But then I looked at you. You didn't blink. You didn't flinch. You fought physics itself to keep us alive. Do you know what that meant to me? To every soldier you brought back?" Riley swallowed hard. "They call it courage, but you want to know the truth. I wasn't brave. I was terrified. Every trip I thought, this is it. This is the one where we don't come back." Maria smiled faintly. "That's the point, Riley. Courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about flying anyway." The words lingered, soft, true, and for the first time in months, Riley let herself believe them. But even in belief, doubt remained. One evening, alone again in her quarters, Riley held the Medal of Honor in her hand. Its weight pressed against her palm, heavy with meaning she couldn't quite claim. She whispered into the silence, as if asking the medal itself. "Was it worth it? Every risk, every scar, every night I don't sleep?" The medal, of course, gave no answer. But somewhere deep inside, Riley knew the answer was not simple. Worth wasn't measured in medals or ceremonies. Worth was measured in the soldiers who had walked off that helicopter alive, in the children who still had fathers, in the families who still had sons and daughters. That was the truth she carried, heavy, painful, but real. And as she set the medal back down, her reflection in the polished surface caught her eye. For the first time, she didn't see the woman they had doubted, or the pilot they had dismissed. She saw something else, someone defined not by what others believed, but by what she had done when the world called it impossible. Sometimes being called a hero feels like a lie, but living for the people you saved, that was the truth she could accept. What do you do after rewriting the rules of survival? Riley Thompson never asked for the job, but the Army gave it to her anyway. The aviation school wanted her to design an entirely new training module. Her name now appeared on briefing schedules, flight school bulletins, and course materials. Young cadets whispered her name like it was legend. She didn't feel like a legend. Walking into a classroom of fresh recruits felt stranger than flying through missile fire. Rows of young faces turned toward her, their eyes bright, eager, reverent. Some of them were women, more than she had ever seen in one place. They stared at her not with doubt but with something heavier, expectation. "Ma'am," one cadet asked nervously during her first lecture, "how do you keep control when everything goes wrong, when the aircraft is dying under you?" Riley paused. The room held its breath. They expected tactics, formulas, textbook procedures. She could give them those, she had written them, but she also knew the truth. "You don't control the aircraft," she said quietly. "You control yourself. Fear will tell you to give up. Panic will tell you to freeze. But if you can hold steady, if you can breathe through the chaos, the machine will follow." Silence, a different kind of silence than the one she had known in briefing rooms years ago. Not dismissal, not doubt, respect. She moved on, explaining emergency aerodynamics, the physics of torque without a tail rotor, the razor-thin techniques she had invented in that valley. But inside, she carried a quiet ache, because she knew you couldn't teach the silence of knowing you might not live another minute. You couldn't write into a manual the sound of soldiers screaming for help while the sky burned. But maybe, just maybe, she could teach them enough that they'd never have to feel it for themselves. After class, Riley walked the tarmac where Apache gleamed under sun. She ran her hand along their frames, remembering the battered 77 Alpha. It had been mounted in a museum now, a plaque beneath it reading Guardian Angel, the helicopter that saved 500 lives. Visitors took photos beside it, children staring wide-eyed, veterans saluting. But to Riley, it was no relic. It was a coffin she had refused to lie down in. Maria Santos often found her there, standing in silence. "You talk to it sometimes," Maria teased once, her arm still bandaged but her spirit unshaken. Riley smirked faintly. It listened when no one else did. Maria leaned against the cold fuselage. "You know, not everything has to be carried alone." "I'm not carrying it alone." "Yes, you are," Maria said softly. "Every night I see it in your eyes. You don't sleep, you don't laugh, you don't let yourself live." The words cut deeper than any shrapnel. Riley wanted to argue, but she couldn't. She still woke in sweat, rotor noise echoing in her head. She still caught herself flinching at sudden noises. She still felt her heart tighten every time she saw a map with red zones. But admitting it felt like weakness, and she had spent her life fighting to prove weakness wasn't in her blood. Weeks later, she sat alone in her office, grading reports from her cadets. Outside, laughter drifted from the mess hall. The sound felt foreign, almost intrusive. She stared at the papers without reading them. Her hand drifted to the drawer where the Medal of Honor lay, still in its case. She hadn't worn it since the ceremony. The knock at the door broke her trance. Colonel Hayes entered, slower than she remembered him in the field. Age seemed to have caught him since that day in the briefing room. "Captain," he said, settling into a chair across from her, "I've been reading reports. Your curriculum is already changing the way we train. The first class under your module just passed their evaluations with the highest scores we've ever seen." Riley nodded faintly. "That's good." Hayes studied her. "But you don't look like someone who believes it." She stayed quiet. "Riley," he said gently, "you've carried the impossible on your shoulders. Don't forget carrying doesn't always mean healing. You've done more than enough." Her throat tightened. For months she'd been holding herself together with grit alone, pretending the weight didn't crush her. But hearing it acknowledged, hearing permission to lay it down, it almost broke her. Almost. "I'm fine, sir," she said, her voice steady, because anything else would have felt like admitting defeat. But Hayes' eyes lingered, filled with something like fatherly sorrow. "You don't have to be fine to matter." He left her with that, and the words stayed like a splinter she couldn't pull free. Time pushed forward. The world began to forget. New headlines replaced old. Other battles claimed attention. Riley's name shifted from breaking news to history lesson. But not for the cadets. To them, she was living proof that the impossible wasn't untouchable. One evening, a young female pilot in training approached her after class. Her voice shook as she spoke. "Ma'am, I wanted to say thank you. Before I came here, people told me I was wasting my time, that women didn't belong in the cockpit, that I'd never make it. But then I read your story, and now I know I can." Riley froze. For a moment, the words pierced the fog she'd been living in, not because they erased the scars, but because they reminded her that those scars had meaning. She placed a hand on the cadet's shoulder. "You don't have to be me, you just have to be you. That's enough." The girl nodded, eyes wet. Afterward, Riley sat in the empty hangar, staring at the silhouettes of helicopters against the setting sun. For the first time in months, she felt something shift inside her. Not peace, not yet, but a glimmer of it. Because maybe Maria was right. Maybe not everything had to be carried alone. Maybe some burdens were meant to be shared, not with commanders, not with politicians, but with the young women who would fly after her. That night, she wrote in her journal, a habit she'd never kept before but suddenly needed. "They call me a hero, but what I really am is a survivor. I survived the laughter, I survived the silence, I survived the valley, and maybe survival itself is the story, because if survival can be taught, then courage doesn't die with one pilot, it passes on." The words bled from her pen like confession. She closed the journal, sat back, and for the first time in a long time, she let herself breathe without the weight of rotors in her chest. It didn't mean the scars were gone. They never would be. But maybe scars weren't only reminders of pain. Maybe they were proof that even after breaking, you could keep flying. And in that quiet, she understood something she hadn't before. Her mission hadn't ended in that valley. It had only just begun. How long can someone carry the weight of silence before it crushes them? Riley had been strong for months, too strong. She wore her uniform with precision, taught her cadets with clarity, smiled when commanders paraded her in front of cameras. To the world, she was unshakable, the woman who had flown through hell and come back. But late at night, when the base went quiet, the cracks showed. Sometimes she woke with her heart racing, drenched in sweat, hands reaching for controls that weren't there. Sometimes she swore she could hear the shriek of missiles, the rattle of gunfire, the desperate voices screaming through static. And sometimes, worse than all of it, she dreamed of silence. The suffocating silence of the cockpit when she wasn't sure if she'd make it another minute. It haunted her more than the explosions, because silence meant she was alone. One night the storm broke. She had just finished another long day of training lectures, her voice hoarse, her body running on coffee and discipline. The cadets had asked her endless questions. What did it feel like? How did you not freeze? What went through your mind? She gave them answers, technical and careful, but none of them real. The real answers, fear, rage, doubt, she buried where no one could see. That night back in her quarters, she sat on the edge of her bunk. The Medal of Honor gleamed faintly from its case on the desk. Her journal lay open, blank page waiting, but no words came. Her hands shook too badly to hold the pen. She pressed her palms to her face, willing herself to breathe. But instead of calm, memories slammed into her. The valley, the smoke, Maria's blood soaking the cockpit, the soldier screaming for his brother who never made it to the landing zone, the feeling of the Apache spinning out of control, the earth rushing up to kill them both. Her chest tightened, she couldn't breathe, her vision blurred. The pen slipped from her hand and clattered against the floor. The sound broke something inside her. She folded forward, sobs tearing through her like shrapnel. For the first time since that day, Riley Thompson broke. Her body shook with it, every muscle releasing months of locked pain. She buried her face in her hands and let the grief she had carried alone pour out in ragged gasps. She didn't hear the knock, didn't see the door open. "Riley." Maria Santos' voice was soft, steady, pulling her back like a lifeline. Riley lifted her head, tears streaking her face, shame burning in her chest. "I'm fine," she choked out, the same lie she'd told everyone. Maria crossed the room and knelt in front of her. "No, you're not, and you don't have to be." Riley shook her head. "I can't if they see me like this, if they know I—" Maria cut her off, voice sharp now. "If they know you're human, if they know you bled for them and broke for them. Riley, no one survives what you survived without scars." Riley's hands trembled. "I can't stop hearing it. Every time I close my eyes it's there, the rotors, the silence, the fear. I wasn't brave, Maria, I was terrified every second." Maria's eyes softened. "That's what made you brave, you flew anyway." The words hit something deep inside Riley, the part that had been waiting, aching, to hear it spoken aloud. She leaned into Maria, exhausted, letting herself be held. For the first time in months, she wasn't a symbol or a hero or a captain. She was just a human being who had carried too much for too long. And somehow, admitting that felt like the bravest thing she had ever done. The next morning, Riley walked into class with red eyes and a hoarse voice. But when the cadets asked her questions, she answered differently. "How do you keep control when everything goes wrong?" one asked again. Riley paused, breathing slowly. "You don't always. Sometimes you break. Sometimes you cry. Sometimes you're terrified. That doesn't make you weak. It makes you real. And being real is what keeps you alive." The cadets sat stunned. No manual had ever said that. No instructor had ever admitted it. But in their eyes, Riley saw something shift. Not doubt, not pity, understanding. For the first time, she wasn't just teaching tactics. She was teaching truth. Later that week, Maria joined her in the hangar again. They stood in silence, staring at the scarred fuselage of Apache 77 Alpha, now a museum piece. "You ever think about flying again?" Maria asked softly. "Every day." Riley's voice was low, almost reverent. "But not the way people think. Not medals, not proving anything, just flying for me." Maria nodded. "Maybe it's time you let yourself." Riley traced her fingers across the cold metal. For months, the helicopter had felt like a coffin. Now, for the first time, it felt like memory. Painful, yes, but also proof. Proof that even broken things could still fly. That night, Riley opened her journal again. This time, the words came. "I thought strength meant never breaking, but the truth is, strength is what carries you when you do. Strength is crying in the dark and flying again anyway. Strength is admitting you're afraid and still lifting others out of it. I'm not fearless. I never was. I'm just stubborn enough not to quit. And maybe that's enough." She closed the journal with steady hands. The rotors still echoed in her head, but quieter now. Not a scream, more like a whisper. And for the first time, Riley didn't run from it. She listened. Because maybe those echoes weren't curses. Maybe they were reminders. Reminders of survival. Reminders of life. Reminders that she was still here. What do you leave behind when the engines finally fall silent? Months had passed since the valley. The chaos of headlines had faded, replaced by other wars, other stories. The army still called Riley Thompson a hero. Cadets still whispered her name in hallways. The Medal of Honor still gleamed in its case. But Riley no longer lived for medals, or ceremonies, or even survival. She lived for mornings like this, when the hangar doors were open and the sky stretched endless and blue, inviting. She stood there in her flight suit, not as a symbol, not as a legend, but as a pilot. The hum of rotors echoed from another chopper warming up across the tarmac. This time, she wasn't flying into war. She was flying for herself. Maria Santos walked beside her, healed but carrying her own scars with quiet pride. "You sure about this?" Maria asked. Riley smirked faintly. "I was born sure." They climbed into the cockpit of a training Apache. Clean, untouched by battle, the panels gleamed. The glass wasn't spiderwebbed with cracks. The smell was new electronics and machine oil, not blood, not smoke, not burning hydraulics. Riley's hands rested on the controls. For the first time in months, her grip didn't tremble. The engines roared to life. The vibrations thrummed through her bones, familiar and steady. It wasn't the scream of survival anymore. It was the song of flight. As the helicopter lifted, Riley felt something inside her lift too. The rotors beat above her, steady, strong, no longer echoes of fear but reminders of who she was. Not just the woman who had saved 500 soldiers, not just the pilot who had flown the impossible, but Riley Thompson, a soldier who refused to quit when quitting was the easy choice. She looked out across the base. Cadets stood in formation, watching. Some saluted. Others just stared, wide-eyed, knowing they were seeing more than just a pilot take off. They were seeing proof, living, breathing proof, that strength comes in many forms and sometimes the quietest defiance echoes the loudest. In the months that followed, Riley settled into her new rhythm. She taught. She flew training runs. She spoke at graduations, not with speeches about glory but about truth. "You'll be afraid," she told one graduating class. "You'll doubt yourself. You'll hear voices telling you you're not enough. Listen if you want. But when it matters most, fly anyway. Fear doesn't disqualify you. It defines the courage you carry." Her words spread through the cadets like fuel in an engine, not because they were polished or perfect, but because they were real. Sometimes she returned to the museum where Apache 77 Alpha sat in silence, scars still etched into its frame. Visitors gathered around the plaque, pointing, reading, shaking their heads in disbelief. Riley stood in the crowd unnoticed. She didn't correct their stories. She didn't tell them about the fear, the sweat, the nights she thought she would never breathe again. She just watched. One day, a little girl stood before the helicopter, eyes wide. She tugged her father's sleeve. "Daddy, girls can fly too." Her father smiled. "Because of her, sweetheart, because of her." The little girl looked up at the chopper again, her expression fierce with wonder. Riley felt something shift deep inside her chest. Not pride, not relief, something softer, hope. She turned and walked away, leaving the girl with her dreams. Riley still carried the weight of silence. She still woke some nights to the echo of rotors, to the valley burning in her dreams. But she no longer feared those echoes. They were part of her now, like scars written across her soul. She learned to live with them, not against them, to let them remind her of what mattered, not the medal, not the applause, not even the history books. What mattered were the lives still breathing, because she refused to accept impossible. What mattered were the cadets she trained, who would never again walk into briefing rooms unseen or dismissed. What mattered was that little girl in the museum, looking up at a helicopter and seeing her future written in its scars. One evening, long after the sun had set, Riley walked alone across the airfield. The tarmac was quiet, lights glowing faintly, the hum of distant generators filling the night. She paused, looking up at the stars. So many soldiers never got to look up again. She carried them in her heart, the ones lost in that valley, the ones whose names would never be carved into medals or speeches. She whispered into the silence, not sure who she was speaking to. Maybe to them, maybe to herself. "I carried you home." The wind swept across the field, warm, steady, almost like an answer. She closed her eyes, breathed. For the first time, the silence felt lighter. History would remember Captain Riley Thompson as the woman who flew the impossible, the woman who saved 500 lives with a broken helicopter, the first female pilot to wear the Medal of Honor. But those closest to her knew the truth. She wasn't defined by medals or even by missions. She was defined by something quieter, something deeper. When everyone else stayed silent, she spoke by acting. When fear screamed in her chest, she answered by flying anyway. When the world said impossible, she whispered back, "Watch me." And in that defiance, she left behind more than a legacy. She left behind permission, permission for others to rise, permission for others to believe. Because sometimes dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts. And Captain Riley Thompson had acted when it mattered most.